So here we come to section 18, which is Wisdom and the Arhat Ideal. And Sangharakshita starts off by making the link between samadhi and wisdom, and says that there's two ways into wisdom. There's bare insight alone, vipassana, or the shamatha route, which involves increasing deepening of concentration of mind. So the question that's always asked here is, well, do you need to experience dhyana? Do you need to get into those kind of fuller states of samadhi in order to penetrate into insight into the way things are? And Sangharakshita says, well, you don't need anything more than neighbourhood concentration. But of course, I don't think it's good to just dismiss then getting into dhyanas and, see them as just, I just need to get into neighbourhood concentration and then, and that's all I need to do. Because, of course, the dhyanas do play an important role. Even if we remove the idea of getting into all the dhyanas, even just seeing the importance of meditation itself in cultivating wisdom. So I think it is important to have experience of meditation, to get into those states of mind where you can think clearly and lucidly. States of concentration, the dhyanas, give us a kind of vitality to our mind with which we can penetrate wisdom. And I think it's also important for a kind of nihilist, materialist culture, because it shows us that we can tend to dismiss the higher reaches of consciousness and the mind and see matter as paramount, and then we can take a very kind of in a way, utilitarian understanding of meditation, or I just need enough to get insight for myself. And of course, that whole framework of seeing is flawed, because it's not about me getting this thing called insight. So I think in meditation is important to undermine that nihilist, materialist kind of cultural priority of matter over mind. And it's also just pleasurable and enjoyable in itself to see how far the mind can go, to give it that buoyancy, vitality, energy and joy to take us into the spiritual life, which, can on occasion be quite hard work. And I think there's also something else, which is it's important to experience going from the kama loka, so the realm of sense desire, and kind of utilitarian view of the world, where we see the world purely in terms of what we can get out of it, into the realm of the rupa loka. I think this is one way of seeing the transformation of consciousness that's not just about the dhyanas. It's also about seeing what realm the mind can take us into. And in the realm of the rupa loka, we see it's the realm of archetypal form. We see things in terms of their symbols, of the reality behind them as being rich from their own side, rather than what we can just get out of things. So our experience becomes more vivid, more alive, is capable of demonstrating something to us beyond our own craving. And we might experience that on meditation retreats, where colours seem brighter. They seem to point to something more than we usually understand in them. So yes, so there we go. Meditation is important, but of course meditation is not an end in itself. It's a way to concentrate the mind, have a kind of vital, energetic, joyful mind that can then be free to concentrate on reality itself. And wisdom is really about just learning about the Dharma, reflecting on the Dharma, making the Dharmic truths an object for a concentrated mind. So Sangharakshita says, well, it's nothing more than what he's talked about in the last sections: pratichat samutpada, the nidanas, the spiral path, all those things that he's talked about before. It's making them the object of a concentrated mind. And he talks about the three what we usually understand as the three levels of wisdom, not as levels of wisdom, but ways into wisdom. So you have the way into wisdom, which is about learning, hearing the teachings, a way into wisdom which is about reflecting on them yourself, and a way into wisdom which is about seeing into things from a concentrated mind through samadhi. So listening, reflection and meditation in that scheme are three ways into meditation rather than a path. But he does emphasize that we do need to learn the Dharma. We need to learn the Dharma. Unless you're at the feet of an enlightened teacher, you are going to need to learn the Dharma. We're all going to need to learn the Dharma in order to be able to know what we're reflecting on. So we need right view, in other words, before we can have perfect vision. And I think it's really good to reflect in one's own practice. Well, how do I cultivate a practice of studying the Dharma? You know, do I see that as important as my daily meditation practice? And what Dharma am I regularly reflecting on? How do I choose what to reflect on? And how do I reflect? So he talks about, in a way, the goal or the effect of wisdom as being the destruction of the ashravas. So that's desire for sensory experience, desire for becoming, existence, and ignorance. All of those are the ashravas which are transcended upon enlightenment. And it's a very stock phrase, that the destruction of the ashravas. And in that kind of stock phrase, I think it's important that we don't lose the feel for them. I was sitting here trying to reflecting, what do they actually mean? Karmashrava, avijjashrava, bhavashrava. And I was thinking, well, in a way, they're that kind of groping, blind pull, that deep existential craving that's beyond even understanding it as craving. It's a kind of pull outwards towards something else. And of course, one can transform that pull from kamachanda to dharmachanda, from desire for sensory experience to desire for the Dharma. But I think it's going to the real nature of a deep sense of existential dissatisfaction. And of course, nirvana alone is peace. When we realise nirvana, that groping craving, that groping pull ceases. And what the Buddha says that happens at that point is a great bliss. He says the release from karmashrava is a great bliss. Release from bhavashrava is a great bliss. And to remove the conceit I am is the greatest bliss of all. So there is another side to it can sound quite negative, the destruction of the ashravas, but the other side of that is the great bliss. So how do we reflect, and what do we reflect on? Of course, here comes the famous list of the lakshanas, which we're all familiar with, but Bhante really does evoke them, but also how they relate to each other. So the first one is impermanent, and he says this is logically prior, because I think this is the one where we're really going to be able to reflect on it in our experience most immediately. So he says that in reflecting on this, he says, well, what is put together can come undone. It's as simple as that. You know, if things are compounded, if they're not things in themselves, then they're always moving towards their end. They're always moving towards impermanence. And I think it's good to reflect on how we reflect on impermanence. You know, do we think about it as coming out of being or as coming into being? Do we think about it as destruction, or do we think about it more in terms of the spiral path as actually an ongoing creation that's possible as well? And of course, nirvana is the deathless. There's no change in nirvana. But I think it's good to, when we're reflecting on the Dharma, the Nirvana being eternal, it's not a static thing either. Sangharakshita later called it irreversible creativity. So it's creativity that doesn't have an end, that's constantly unfolding. He says there's eternity in its consistency. And then we've got dukkha. He said, well, if things were permanent, maybe they could be a source of satisfaction. Although I suspect the satisfaction with most things would be fairly short-lived if they were permanent. But anyway, if things are impermanent, then they are also going to come to an end, and even things that we love and enjoy will cause us suffering. He says, happiness can be attained either when existence accords with our desires, or when our desires are in harmony with existence. True, the second alternative is difficult, but the first is impossible. If we cannot gain happiness by refashioning the world, we shall have to find it by reforming ourselves. So really we're going to have to align our expectation with reality, and the reality is that things are impermanent. And that can also be a kind of liberation for us, because when we do align our desires with reality, what we find is happiness. Because the world isn't going to break its promises, or the promises that we imagined for it. So there can be this kind of release when you just accept the way things are. But it's a different kind of happiness. It's not the happiness of getting what we want. It's the happiness of freedom from unrealistic expectations. So yes, and then we come to no self, anatta. And he goes back to that, the model that we previously looked at in relation to the true nature of all dharmas, where he's talking about the dynamic method and the static analytical model. So in the first, the dynamic, we can see that things are not self because they're impermanent. So, and this is related to the idea of what is myself is what I can control. And of course, we can't control our body. We definitely know that when we're sick. We can't directly control our body. We can't directly control our mind. It's constantly changing. So where's the self in this? And it's an interesting thing to do, is to reflect on the mind, to see how it's constantly changing, and to ask ourselves, where is the self in this? Which bit could I call myself? But of course, there's another way round of looking at that too, which is that because things are no self, they're impermanent. And this is the static model, where we take things into their constituent parts, and take this sort of analysis of things into their constituent parts. Bhante's using on this occasion is the 5 skandhas. So they're like heaps of grain, ever-changing heaps of grain as well. So he goes into all the 5 skandhas and sees, well, they're not things in themselves either. They're constantly changing. Rupa, which is really the objective content of our perceptual situation, is always changing. Our thoughts, our perceptions are always changing, as our sensory input is always changing. The objects of our awareness is always changing. Our volitions are always changing, and our Vedana, which is a response to our sensory information, is also changing as well. Form is not ours, give it up. Feeling is not ours. Perception is not ours, give them up. And of course, you're not giving them up in the sense of not being a human being existing in the world, but giving up this identification with them, giving up trying to fix them at any one point. And he says, well, in a way, all the lakshanas can be deduced from each other. Because things are no self, they're just put together out of process and constituent parts, then they're impermanent, and because they're impermanent, they're a source of suffering. But what he's really asking you to do and giving you clues how to do it is to really look at our experience, to look at what our experience actually is. You know, the three lakshanas themselves are in a way quite simple as a list to learn, but we have to really apply that to our experience, and that's where a concentrated mind comes in, because it's through a sort of malleable, vivid, concentrated state of mind that we can really penetrate into the significance of our experience. There's a beautiful quote from Yeshe Sogyal, which she makes this point too. She says, "Spread the world of illusion before you and pierce it to the marrow. Search every part of it. Drive into it with your mind. Let vitality itself pervade your mind." So spread the world of illusion before you and pierce it with your mind. Pierce it to the marrow. And he says the more obviously evanescent a thing is, the less difficult should be a recognition of its insubstantiality. So maybe the best place to start is the mind itself, which is always changing. And he quotes that beautiful passage from the Pali scriptures of someone looking at the bubbles that are created in a river, water bubbles coming in and out of existence all the time, a constant flow, and comparing that to the five skandhas, seeing that all are empty, unreal and insubstantial. And if we do that as a consistent practice, which can be done all the time, you know, that quote from the Pali Suttas about someone looking at a river shows it's not just in meditation. We can be doing this process all the time in all our activities, wherever we are, whether we're at a train station or by a river or on solitary retreat or in communication with someone. We can constantly be reflecting on the lakshanas, and that's why it's important that we really kind of know these lists, because when we know them we can apply them to our experience in our everyday life. And if we do that, vipassana arises. So he says vipassana is a bit like flashes of lightning, the series of instantaneous time transcending flashes that are not continuous with but utterly discrete from the phenomenal order. So you start off with these flashes, and they're discrete from the phenomenal order because in a way they're a completely different way of understanding the world. They're completely discrete from our ordinary states of mind and our ordinary level of consciousness. So from the point of view of time, you're setting up conditions where you can really see into the nature of reality. But from the point of view of space, when you do see into reality, it's completely different from the mental states that you've had before. And that's why, in a way, the path is sudden and gradual. It's gradual because it's dependent on conditions and you're setting up those conditions all the time. But it's sudden because when it happens, it literally is like a sideways leap from your ordinary consciousness. And Bhante's saying you have more and more of those flashes until they're sustained into a continuous radiance. And of course, one thing you might want to talk about in your groups is about any experiences of insight that you've had. Actually, Vajratara's got a few very good articles about insight experiences, whether to talk about them, and post-insight practice. He's got those articles on his website, so I do recommend having a look at that if that's a theme that interests you. And what he says about it is he says you can have some what he calls knocks your socks off insight experience into the nature of reality, and that's it, you know, there's no going back. He says that's rare. You can also have an insight into reality which is dependent on conditions, and when you're not in those conditions, you're not in that state of mind, but you'll get back into that state of mind when you set up those conditions again. So for example, you'll be in that state of mind when you're meditating, but not when you're not meditating. And he says there's also insight that's dependent on conditions and happens and then becomes a memory, and it's an inspirational memory, but it is a memory, and you're not in that mental state now. He says the main pitfall is to over-identify with any insight experience as happening to a self that can attain something, because then we fix it, we make it our own, and then it can stop us from deepening practice. So whatever experiences we have of insight, maybe they are like flashes of insight, of flashes of lightning that can illuminate our practice, give us motivation, give us confidence on the path to keep deepening our Dharma practice and our practice of reflection. And the last part of this section, Bhante goes into the Arahants and the sort of levels of insight that we can attain, particularly found in the Pali commentaries. And we'll be familiar with some of these, I'm sure: the stream entrant, the once returner, the non-returner, and the Arahant. And again, he's saying it's not a possession that you then have. You kind of enter onto a path of that level of attainment. And that he quotes from the Parinibbana Sutta that where there is the Eightfold Path, there you will find Arahants, you'll find stream entrants, you'll find once returner and non-returners. So in other words, where there's the Eightfold Path, there you'll find people with transcendental insight, the Arya Sangha, great people, noble people. And of course that gives us confidence because we know the Eightfold Path, we practice the Eightfold Path, so it remains a real possibility for us. And maybe it's helpful to talk about in your groups about whether we do think in terms of, for example, stream entry and how we envisage stream entry. It's interesting that when he talks about it in this chapter, he talks about it as the fetters, but he also talks about it in the sort of usual categories that one will find, particularly in the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha is talking about stream entry. He talks about stream entry as having a real and lucid faith, a perfect confidence that the Buddha really is all the qualities of the Triratna Vandana, and the Dharma really is all the qualities again found in the Triratna Vandana. That the Dharma really is attainable by the wise. It's of the nature of personal invitation. It's timeless. All those qualities. And the Sangha really is, for example, an incomparable source of goodness in the world. And again, all the qualities of the Triratna Vandana. And that one's ethical practice is unspotted, unmottled, is not creating a mess in the world, in other words. So stream entry can also be envisaged as faith and a practice of ethics. And in reflecting on this, I think it's because it's stream entry, one way of looking at it is that the three jewels and ethical practice become so beautiful to you. We find them so utterly compelling that it's easy to leave behind a kind of deluded state of being. So the gravitational pull of nirvana is greater than the gravitational pull of samsara at that point. And that's one way that Sangharakshita describes stream entry. So it's good to look at, stream entry and the other stages of insight and how we envisage them. Because I think how we envisage the goal is related to how we will experience moving towards that goal. It will be related to how we shape our lives in relation to the ideal. And of course, arahantship is nothing different from, in the Buddha's case, than any other enlightened being's case. So this is where Sangharakshita is really working against this view that the arahantship, the goal as envisaged in the Pali literature, is somehow spiritually selfish. He says it can't be spiritually selfish because it's not an attainment that you can actually have or own. And he talks about the relationship between selflessness and compassion. Selflessness is one way of looking at compassion. Because if we cease to prioritize our own needs over others, then we're able to respond to others as they need. So it's interesting that this section should end with compassion. And I think that's also the lesson of wisdom. How do we know that someone has really gained insight? Well, Sangharakshita says in the seminar on the nature of existence, he says, well, we know that someone's gained insight by the fact that they become progressively less selfish and more able to respond to the needs of others.